All right, so in this lesson, we're doing this dirt explosion, which combines several of the techniques that we've covered in this course so far. So we have a fuel explosion in here, and then we also have several different particle flow emitters giving us these different explosion types. So we have some dirt on the bottom here, which is brown. And then we have some darker smoke and some lighter smoke, and they're all mixing together using the RGB mixing. So let's set it up from scratch. I am working in units, meters, and let's make one unit 10 centimeters just to give us an optimal scale for what we need. I'm gonna start by going under particle systems and create a PF source. Maybe let's put it in the middle of the grid. And we can make it a circle. I'm gonna hit Alt W to make this full screen and open the particle view. And basically what I wanna do first is to get this kind of shape. So I wanna get the particles to sort of explode outwards. So first let's go under birth and let's emit the particles for just one frame because we want it to be an explosion. So they just explode for one frame. And let's emit maybe 40 of them. Let's go under speed and hit reverse so that they are exploding upwards. And let's give them a speed of maybe 200 meters with a 30 meter variation. So since I've already done this, I kind of know roughly what numbers should go in, but we might have to adjust these as we go. And I'm gonna give it a divergence of 30 degrees so that they sort of spread out as they go up. So we're already getting that sort of explosion look that we're after. Now, right now the particles just last forever, so we need to add a delete operator and drag it under shape. And we can actually delete shape and we can right click and delete rotation as well. And I want to delete them by particle H and give them a lifespan of 3 frames with a 2 frame variation so that they don't just all die at once. You see they sort of gradually disappear. So we could run the simulation right now and we would get some smoke trails, but you do need a lot more particles to get the amount of detail that you need. So we really need to create sort of a particle trail. And for that we need a spawn operator. So I'm gonna just pick that over here and put it right under delete. And I wanna spawn them by travel distance. So now I'm spawning new particles, but they all have the exact same speed. So they're creating this sort of bubble shape. So we need to change the inherited amount of speed to a lower value. So maybe let's do 10%. And now we're getting that trail that we're after. And I'm gonna set the variation to 100%. And let's give it a divergence of 40. And we're getting this sort of Christmas tree shape. So let's give it a delete operator to the spawn particles and connect it to here. And I'm again gonna say by particle H and set this to maybe a lifespan of 4 with a variation of 2. And I guess the Christmas tree thing is some kind of an error because as soon as I add that delete operator, it's updated. So this is really what we're after, is this sort of firework look where we're emitting particles out of that main particle. So this is what you should have right now. So let's make a standard Phoenix grid as always. And let's make a Phoenix source. And now you can just add and click on any of the particles and just, this is a good question because you want to think about which event you actually want to add. This is gonna matter because we're gonna have more than one PF source and it can get kind of confusing. So let's go back into the particle view and make sure that what we really want is the PF source 001 and event 01 and event 02. So right now it's everything we have, but that might change as we add more sources. So I'm gonna go back into the source, click add, and I know that I can add all of these and be fine. So we know that we only wanna emit smoke out of this because we're going for that sort of dirt look. So it's gonna be only this light smoke here. So I'm gonna give it maybe an outgoing velocity of 10 meters with, let's do something like 0.3 for noise, just to give it even more randomization. And let's enable RGB and give it that light smoke color. So I'm gonna go into the gray hue, and then you can maybe give it a little bit of the brownish color just to get a little bit of like the dust look. So maybe something like this should work. And I'm gonna give it a motion velocity of, let's do 2. because I want the smoke to be given a lot of speed by the particles and continue rising up. And let's go into the dynamic settings here. And before we forget, let's go under output and output velocity, and let's output RGB because we want to mix different colors of the smoke. And while we're here, you can also pick the path for the simulation. Now, I don't usually mention this, but don't forget to save your work. I just did that because especially when dealing with particle flow, which hasn't been updated in like, 2 decades, Max can crash out of nowhere. So definitely save your work. And let's go under grid and enable, first let's do jammed minus on Z as usual and enable the adaptive grid. We can do by smoke because really smoke is covering most of our frame here. And let's give it a threshold of 0.01 with maybe a 1 for extra margin. The grid resolution is good at 0.1 meters. Now let's go under dynamics. Now, since we're going for that sort of heavy dirt look, I found that giving it a bit of a negative buoyancy actually gave me nicer results. So we can do something like minus 0.5. I'm gonna leave all of the massive vorticity where it is, and we can maybe do just conservation quality of 20 to start. And I would give it at least 2 steps per frame because the particles are moving fast. So with all of these settings in place, let's just run the sim and see how it looks. So I'm running the sim and I would say that this is not too bad for 10 minutes of work basically. This is pretty cool. Now this is an interesting case to show you the importance of steps per frame. Basically right now the particles are too fast for Phoenix to catch up. So we're gonna need more steps per frame to actually make sure that all of this is seen by Phoenix. So let's go back under dynamics, and actually we have to do at least 3 steps per frame to make this work. Now what I would also do right now is go under the volumetric options, and we can go under smoke color, and right now it's still set to constant. So let's set it to RGB so we can see the dust color that we gave it. And under smoke opacity, we can maybe increase the opacity a little bit. So maybe let's do 0.7. So now that we've done this once, you would basically just repeat the same process and add more detail to your explosion as needed. So as you can see, basically I did this main smoke trail of the light dust. Then I have another particle flow down here creating this brown dust. Then I have another one in here that you can barely see creating this darker dust. And then I have another one creating the fuel. So let's actually do the fuel next because that's the most exciting part, I think, is mixing these together, and then we can add more detail as needed. Well, it's as simple as just going back into the particle flow viewer. So you can just hit 6 on your keyboard to get back in here. And then you can just select all of this, hold shift and drag and make a copy and just say copy OK. It may take a few seconds for it to get its bearings. But then here it is. This is your copy of that exact flow. And what I would do is just maybe go under speed and give it another seed. And then you can, let's just delete the Phoenix cache so it's not in the way. So you can just select the grid and click on this trash can here. And then you can give it another color just so that you're not confused by what's what. So I'm gonna make this maybe green, and these particles can maybe be like red. So remember, the orange ones is our smoke and the green ones are gonna be our fuel. So I just wanna give the fuel maybe less speed so it doesn't go as high up. So maybe something like this. Maybe I wanna birth more of those particles. So maybe let's do amount 60. And maybe let's go back under speed and give it more divergence just so that the fire spreads out more. And maybe the variation is a bit too much. I kind of want the explosion to be more stuck together. So maybe we can do just 15 for the variation. And you can always just drag the slider to see what you're getting. And it looks like we're still running into that Christmas tree issue, but I'm just gonna ignore that. It's probably just gonna update in a bit again. Alright, so I just found out that it was because for some reason the delete operator here got disconnected. So I just connected it again and that Christmas tree issue is gone. So let's just say that these green particles are gonna be our fuel, and I'm happy with how it looks right now. So let's go back down here and let's create another source. And you might want to place these sources somehow so you can tell which one is which. So I'm going to be putting them next to each other from left to right. So the left one here is going to be the initial dust, and this one here is going to be the fuel. So let's go over here and select the particles. And now remember, we want to do event 3 and 4 from the PF source 2. So we're not going to select event 1 and event 2 because that's the previous dust. So I'm going to say OK. And let's do outgoing velocity 10 again with maybe 0.3 for noise. Let's disable temperature, disable smoke, and let's just enable fuel. And let's enable RGB, and let's maybe give it like a dark black color for like a sort of gasoline smoke. So maybe almost pure black, like a dark gray. And then I would just go back under the dynamic settings, and we need to go under output, and we actually need to output the fuel grid channel too, now that we're emitting fuel. If you don't output this channel, you cannot enable burning. You have to enable this. So now we can go under fuel, enable burning. As we did before, we need to give it a temperature that will actually ignite. So I'm gonna do 290. We can leave the energy at 10. Maybe we can do fuel depletion of, let's leave that at 1 as well. And just the propagation is usually too high. So let's set that to 5 or 4. And with all of that in place, let's run our sim and see what we get. All right, so I'm running the sim and it's starting to look pretty cool. You can see that we have the fuel here with the dark black smoke mixing with the lighter smoke. Our fuel is igniting and is shaded with the fire shader. The particles still seem to be too fast for Phoenix to catch it, so we're gonna have to do even more steps per frame for our final simulation, but everything else is looking good. So I'm just gonna stop the simulation right now and go into the volumetric shader. And same as we did before, now you could just go under the fire tab and play with the shading for the fire. So maybe as usual, I would just sort of brighten it up. So make a point and raise this up, and you can play with the fire multiplier. You can play with the colors here. So everything just like we covered in the earlier lessons. So maybe we'll just make it more sort of a darker orange. And now we can go back to add even more detail to this explosion. So we've done the lighter smoke, we've done the explosion part, and now maybe let's add this brown sort of ground dust on the bottom. And just by the way, I think what might help is clicking on this main PF source node, and then make sure that the viewport is set to 100% so you can see all of the particles. And the integration step, let's set that to 1/4 frame. So this might help with allowing Phoenix to see the particles as it's calculating all the steps. So I'm gonna do that for both of the nodes. Set this one to 1/4 frame as well and give the viewport 100%. So let's copy all of this one more time. So hold shift and drag and copy. All right, and once again, I'm gonna just select our simulation, click the trash can so we can see the particles. Now let's give this third node different colors again. So instead of green, maybe we can do blue. And maybe for these, we can do something like yellow. And remember, these blue particles now are gonna be the ground dust. So I think I'm just gonna reduce the speed quite a bit. I'm gonna maybe increase the variation. I'm gonna increase the divergence a lot because I sort of just want these to spread out to the side. In fact, what we could do is just set this to almost like a shock wave. So we can do icon center out. And maybe we can just play with the divergence to get it to only cover the ground. So maybe something like this. Some of them are just gonna shoot underground, but that's fine. And maybe let's give birth to even more of them. So maybe we can do something like 100. And maybe let's just delete them sooner. So I would give them a variation of maybe just 1 frame. And I would say that maybe everything else can stay where it is. So once again, let's create one more source and put it next to the other ones to keep it somewhat organized. I would just say add and add the blue particles. So that's gonna be event 5, 6 and PF source number 3. Let's give it outgoing velocity of 10, noise of maybe 0.5 because it's sort of this ground dust. And let's just emit smoke. And for the RGB, I'm gonna give it like a dark brownish color. So maybe something like this. I would kind of like more brown. All right, this should work. So it's sort of like the dark soil that the explosion comes out of. Say okay. And for motion velocity, leave that at 1. All right, so everything else looks good. So I'm just gonna go back into the grid settings and just maybe let's give it an extra margin of 5 just to make sure that the grid will be catching up. And I'm gonna enable maximum expansion, and we don't really need it on -z, but on +z, I kind of maybe only want it to go this high up, maybe not more than that. And you can give it some room on the sides, so on the X as well. So this is the maximum that the simulation will be allowed to expand into, maybe a bit more on the Z as it rises up. So maybe something like this should work. And I'm gonna increase the cell size just to make it faster. So let's start at only maybe like 1.5 million total cells, so 0.14 meters for the resolution. And maybe let's give it 4 steps per frame. So let's go back under dynamics and give it 4 steps per frame. And with all of that in place, let's run the simulation, see what we get. All right, so I really like where this is going. I can tell by the way it's moving already that it's gonna end up very similar to what I had before. So I'm happy with that. Now I just wanna let you know that you might say, well, what if I want some of these opacities of the smoke to be less and some to be more? You can't really adjust them separately, but what you can do is, let me just pause the sim. You can go into the individual sources and you can always just emit less smoke. So right now it's set to 1. You can maybe just even set it to like 0.1 and get way less smoke if you feel like maybe the opacity of some of this is too much. Then you can also just go back into the volumetric options. You can play with the simple smoke opacity. So maybe I would make it something like 0.4 and get a much lighter explosion that way. Now, what you can also do is say based on smoke, and we haven't really touched this yet, but it's similar to the fire curve. If I drag this point from left to the right, you can see how it's eating the smoke away from the outside to the inside. So this is an interesting way to sort of get different opacities of the smoke. So you can maybe lower this to get an overall less opacity on the entire smoke surface. Or you can just create points to control which areas of the smoke are to be how thick. So this is really good for explosions where maybe you want some of the fire to be revealed, but you still want the smoke in the middle to be thick and stuff like that. So I would encourage you to play with this curve to see what kind of effects you can get. I personally feel like less opacity kind of looks nicer for this specific explosion because it just makes it look more like dust instead of like a heavy smoke. So I would say this looks pretty good. And even though the explosion is paused, I can just sort of click through it and see what we have. So I love this ground dust that we're getting, that thick sort of brown dirt, and then the fire kicks in and all of it starts blending together until eventually it creates this mushroom cloud and rises up. So as always, the project file for this is under the video if you'd like to dig through that. And I'll see you in the next lesson.